This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, an online learning community. Do you ever worry if you're doing research and prospect management correctly? At the Institute, we turn researchers into fundraising intelligence assets, leading your development officers to the biggest and best donor prospects, and bringing your organization major gift success.
Oftentimes, where I see the research team being helpful is in identifying additional prospects who have come to the table as a result of relationships with your board members or other donors. And there, again, I return to the basics. The relationship is key, and figuring out who in that person's circle of influence can help you identify ways that they want to be involved.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Karen Cochran, CFRE, founder and chief philanthropic innovator at Philanthropy Innovators. Hello, Karen. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Well, thank you, Jen. It's a pleasure to join you and to be engaged with your audience here.
So before we jump into talking about research and transformational giving, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share briefly how you got into fundraising. Everybody's curious about that, what your career's been like, and then very curious about what you're doing right now.
Certainly. I found fundraising as my calling as a paid student caller. So that'll tell you how long my career's been, because what I started in is basically obsolete at this point. But I was a student at West Virginia University. I was a marketing major. They didn't have nonprofit curriculum back then. But I found that I really was inspired by the donors I got to talk to and their desire to make things better for the students at West Virginia University. I spent my entire career in higher education, academic medicine, and nonprofit volunteering. And about 3 years ago, I decided it was time to do something completely different. And I was talking to a good friend of mine about what that should be. And I actually had a job opportunity on the table. And her exact words to me were, "Surely you didn't call me to validate that idea." And she got my attention, and I said, "Okay, well then tell me what I'm supposed to do." And she proceeded to share that she thought, and as I talked to others, they thought, that the real opportunity for me was to take what's in my head and to share it as broadly as possible. And so I established Philanthropy Innovators in July of 22, and have been doing just that ever since.
That's wonderful. I love the name too, Philanthropy Innovators. What made you choose that name?
Well, thank you for that. I chose Philanthropy Innovators because after 30 plus years in the business, I felt like innovation was key to helping people move forward. And I think it provides a broad umbrella for the services we focus on, which are philanthropic strategy, executive coaching, and interim leadership.
I had the privilege and the pleasure of hearing your presentation at AFP Icon this year in 2025, and you talked about 5 ways to develop billion-dollar relationships. Now, we know that the ultra-wealthy have been giving more and more to campaigns and to organizations generally, and so it created quite a buzz at the conference. Like, people were talking about it in sessions long after yours. And one of the things you said there really hit a mark for me. You mentioned that these transformational donors represent 1 in 3 of current donors. So that means two of those transformational gifts came from sort of outside the current donor base. And when I think about prospect research and prospect management, like that presents an interesting prospect identification challenge. I'm curious if you can tell me, how have you worked with organizations, either as a consultant or in your past experience, to identify those donors inside or outside the database?
So, like any philanthropic gift, it begins with relationships. And I think what I was trying to stress at AFP Icon, and I'm really pleased to hear your feedback, is that you need to pay attention to the relationships that you have first of all, and nurture those relationships, especially if your research team has identified a particular individual as having capacity beyond where they may be giving in your organization. That's an opportunity. But those transformational gifts don't happen overnight. No pun intended. I think many of us are aware of the $2 billion gift that Phil Knight just made for cancer research. That's a decade-long relationship with that particular medical center and his interest in cancer. Oftentimes, where I see the research team being helpful is in identifying additional prospects who have come to the table as a result of relationships with your board members or other donors. And there, again, I return to the basics. The relationship is key, and figuring out who in that person's circle of influence can help you identify ways that they want to be involved. Because what we know is engagement precedes investment, and that stewardship at any giving level is key to keeping that relationship moving forward and to keeping the interest in a particular organization high.
That makes a lot of sense. So I would call that relationship mapping, that circle of influence, where we're looking at someone who is already an advocate for our organization, and then where do they have relationships that may have capacity and interest. And I know organizations do this successfully. But one of the challenges I've had is that sometimes the development officer isn't really well versed or comfortable with working with that trustee or that top donor and talking to them about these relationships. How have you seen it played out? I mean, is research providing you with a list and you take that to the trustee? Like, what's the kind of cadence there?
So I think it's most important when working with a trustee or a volunteer or a board member that you start with their comfort level and that you ask questions about their experience helping other organizations like yours in this way. If they're a first-time volunteer, they may not understand the depth and breadth of research that might be available to them. They also may not be comfortable with the level of research that we know is public knowledge out there today. So I think it's really critical that you start with your volunteer and their comfort level. You define what success looks like, and I like to not make the ask too big. So oftentimes I'll start with 3, 5, 10, whatever seems right in terms of names. I think it can be overwhelming for volunteers who haven't done this on a regular basis before to receive a list of 100 people in their zip code who happen to have given at $100 or above. I think it's important to remember that these volunteers give their most precious gift of not just their resources in terms of financial resources, but they give their time. And what I find is that as someone progresses up the financial ladder of success, that gift of time in many ways is almost more valuable to them than an allocation of their assets. So again, I return to the comfort of the volunteer, supporting the volunteer through the process, and active listening. If you perceive that someone is saying, I'm not really comfortable with knowing X, Y, or Z, then you need to tailor what you're bringing to them so that they can be most effective.
That is perfect advice. And it means that the researcher can also help coach newer development officers, perhaps, if this is a smaller organization, and take a look at, is the trustee new to this? Are they coming from family wealth? Are they giving at these levels other places? And help kind of prep and strategize with that development officer on that outreach. That makes a lot of sense.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
So once we have all these names in campaign, a lot of times we're building first the lead gift names, sourcing them, working through them, but also what the campaign could look like based on our donor base. And once these names are brought up, like on my end as a consultant, we can look at the data, but we often don't have access to the insider information, people that have met with them, what giving history or engagement they've had with the organization. And so there needs to be these next steps of keeping that list moving, like who are we knocking out out of the list? For what reason? Who are we keeping in? And sometimes that falls apart. How can research and prospect management really best support that pipeline movement, especially to keep that campaign going?
That's a great question. Personally, I've always seen the partnership with research as critical to your success as a development officer. And I've leaned in heavy to their ability to provide discipline and underpinning in a campaign situation. So the way I like to do it as a leader is to step into the situation and to empower the research team to not just regularly identify prospects for review, but to actually manage the rhythm with which we review relationships. We take into account what you said. We've had a conversation, it's not the right time, whatever the feedback may be, and to keep us moving. Because as we all know, you start the campaign at a certain point in time, and you usually take a comprehensive look at your data. But that data refreshes, and some of the most important things that come forward during a campaign are the conversations that people have that can't be found in the public record. And so one of the other things I like to do is to lean on the prospect management and identification team to help make sure that there's a culture. And I used to say it this way: if it's not in the system, it didn't happen. So a culture and a commitment to actually making sure that what the development officer finds out gets into the system in the correct and usable form so that it is there in perpetuity.
Nice. I couldn't agree more. If we go into a database and are trying to prep lists and the contact report doesn't give us any information, it's not very helpful. I need more than you spoke to them on the phone. I need to know what happened. It's kind of crazy that we're still saying this all these years later, Karen.
Well, and the other point of that is I'm a proponent and have been throughout my career of you do not put anything in a call report that you don't want to read on the front page of the New York Times. So coaching and providing training for especially newer development officers who need to understand the importance of the data, but the type of data that not only is acceptable, but also will help inform the conversations for years to come is key.
And I'm sensing you have examples and samples, and that is that part of your coaching that you do?
It is part of the coaching that I do. I have a major gifts accelerator that we offer to nonprofits and higher education clients where we take their top 20 to 25 donors and actually run them through the process of strategizing, putting gift amounts out there, working towards those gift amounts, and then regular meetings to actually come in a way that you're accountable so that we can see movement on that particular group of prospects. And like you said, Jen, at times, some of the most valuable information you find out is that now is not the time to have the conversation. As you know, moving that name off the list is just as important because it creates space for a new opportunity.
So I'm curious, as you work with folks on their major gift strategies and that discipline of continuing to work the strategy, what role do you find profiles to play?
Oh, I think they can be extremely valuable for a couple of reasons. One, they give you the opportunity in a snapshot to look at the donor and to look at other things they may have been interested in or other nonprofits they have supported. In a minute, you can get a real sense of how the donor sees themselves within a community because you can see the levels of giving. Sometimes you'll see those stratified with the largest gifts going to obviously organizations that they're closest to, but sometimes board service is linked to that or family connections, long-term relationships, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing I like about a profile as opposed to a full-blown research report is it gives you enough to know the questions to ask. The last thing you want to do as a development professional is walk in and have so much knowledge in your head that you're trying to navigate that it appears that you've stalked this person or you know a little too much for it to be a conversation. Your goal is to present the organization, to engage that person around, ideally, their philanthropy, and to begin to build that relationship. Because regardless of the level of philanthropy, it is all about relationships.
Well, amen to that. I couldn't agree more. And before I let you go, I'm wondering if you have any other tips or resources for research and prospect management professionals on how they can better support development officers who are pursuing a transformational gift.
So I think bringing knowledge to the table is powerful. The team that's responsible for prospect research in many ways is in the best position to bring unbiased data forward. Oftentimes, as we pursue these relationships, our filters or our biases block us from moving forward. And being presented with a new gift that so-and-so may have made to the art museum, or a new gift that the family has just been acknowledged for at their children's school. All of those are clues to how the donor sees themselves. And as we talked before, that circle of influence is really, really key to you maximizing the relationship with your nonprofit.
Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing.
It's been my pleasure. Let's do it again soon.
That was Karen Cochran, CFRE, founder and chief philanthropic innovator at Philanthropy Innovators. Are you inspired to begin finding and nurturing your organization's next transformational donors? I hope so. Karen gave some great advice and tips for both sides of the table, development officers and researchers. If you want to hear more from Karen, visit her website and sign up for her e-newsletter. I'm on it, and she really delivers. Visit www.philanthropyinnovators.com. Hey there! Do you manage a prospect research team, or were you newly hired as a prospect researcher? Then you'll be delighted to hear about the Institute's Career Agent Track. In this bundle of 4 courses, participants learn how to build great profiles, calculate capacity ratings, the basics of prospect identification and prospect management, ethics, and the fundamentals of analytics every team member needs to be skilled in. If you need to build the research skills of a fundraising intelligence asset like this, sign up today at member.prospectresearchinstitute.org/career agent.